London, September 1936. There is a particular silence that exists only in concert halls, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of anticipation, of 500 people simultaneously holding their breath, of the world contracting to a single point of concentrated attention. It is the most valuable silence in human experience because it exists only in the moment before something extraordinary begins, and it vanishes the instant it is answered. The Regal Concert Hall on Kensington Gore had been producing that silence for 87 years. Its interior was the color of old honey and dark mahogany. Its ceiling arched to a height that suggested the aspirations of whoever had designed it were not strictly architectural. The gas lamps along the gallery tier had been converted to electricity in 1921, but the fittings had been kept, so that the light still had the amber quality of an earlier century. Tonight, every seat was occupied, every standing place claimed, and the silence of anticipation had been building for 20 minutes, since the moment the program announced that the evening's performance would be the world premiere of Maestro Raphael Voss's final symphony, composed in the last 3 years of a 50-year career, and that the maestro himself would conduct. Hercule Poirot sat in the third row of the stalls, in the seat that had been reserved for him by a personal letter from the maestro himself, dated 6 weeks earlier. The letter had been warm, affectionate, and slightly peculiar. Peculiar in the way that certain communications are peculiar only in retrospect, when one has reason to reread them. The maestro had written that he hoped Poirot would come, that there was something in the symphony that he wished Poirot specifically to hear, and that the third movement contained something. Here the maestro had paused, apparently, and resumed in a different pen. Something that he believed Poirot would find interesting, given his particular professional gifts. Poirot had read the letter 3 times and then placed it carefully in his breast pocket, where it remained. Beside him sat his acquaintance of 20 years, Mr. Gerald Farrow, a musicologist from the Royal Academy, who attended the Regal as other men attend their club, with the proprietary familiarity of regular custom. Farrow was 60, grey-bearded, with the look of someone who had heard so much music over so long a period that it had reorganized his face into a condition of permanent receptivity. "Extraordinary occasion," Farrow murmured as the orchestra settled. "Extraordinary," agreed Poirot, who was looking not at the stage but at the box to the left of the stage, where a compact silver-haired man of perhaps 50 sat slightly forward in his chair with the attentiveness of ownership. This was Conrad Dean, the proprietor of the Regal Concert Hall, who had, in Poirot's observation, spent the better part of the past 20 minutes looking not at the stage but at the audience, with the expression of a man performing calculations. Then the house lights dimmed, and Maestro Raphael Voss walked onto the stage. He was 70, and he walked like it, but he walked like it in the manner of a man who has made peace with every year and carries them as credit rather than debt. He was tall, white-haired, with a face that the decades had carved into something fine and spare, and he moved to the conductor's podium with the unhurried certainty of someone for whom this particular journey had been made 10,000 times and was still, each time, an act of complete intention. The hall gave him a standing ovation before he had raised his baton. He smiled. He raised one hand, not the baton hand, in a gesture of genuine gratitude, not the performed kind. Then he turned to his orchestra, raised the baton, and the silence became the music. The first movement was, Farrow later said, the finest thing Voss had written since his third symphony of 1912. The second movement was, several critics would write the following morning, before the news had entirely superseded the review, a work of such emotional depth and formal precision that it constituted by itself a justification of the entire evening. The third movement never finished. It began with a passage for strings alone, a theme of extraordinary simplicity, the kind of simplicity that costs a lifetime to achieve. And Maestro Voss conducted it with the concentrated stillness of a man listening to something rather than directing it. And then, at the moment when the theme was about to transform into whatever it was intended to become, the baton wavered. Those in the front rows saw it first. The wavering of the baton, then the slight forward lean, then the baton falling, a small sound, barely audible. That nevertheless silenced the orchestra as completely as a gunshot. Maestro Raphael Voss fell, not violently, not with drama. He subsided slowly from the podium to the stage floor, with the quality of something that has been standing for a long time and has at last decided to stop. Poirot was on his feet before the first scream. He reached the stage in the general confusion of the next 30 seconds, confusion of the particular, urgent kind produced by 500 people simultaneously understanding that something has happened that cannot be undone, that the concert is over in a way that has nothing to do with music. He reached the maestro as two members of the orchestra were crouching beside him, and he knelt, and he took the old man's hand, and he saw in the maestro's eyes, still open, still present, still very much inhabited, the specific clarity of a man who knows exactly what is happening and has perhaps been expecting it. The maestro's lips moved. Poirot leaned close. "The third movement," the maestro said. The voice was very faint. "Listen to the third movement. The score on my desk." A pause in which the clarity in his eyes deepened rather than dimmed, as though the proximity of the end had sharpened everything. "You'll hear it, mon ami. You will understand." And then the clarity went out of his eyes, not quickly but gently, like a lamp reduced by degrees rather than extinguished. Inspector Charles Pemberton of Scotland Yard, who had been in the audience at the invitation of the Regal's management, arrived at Poirot's shoulder. "Heart attack," said Pemberton. "Poor old devil. I probably knew it was coming, the exertion of the performance." "Perhaps," said Poirot. He was looking at the conducting desk, the stand beside the podium where the score rested, where a glass of water sat half consumed, where a small folded piece of manuscript paper lay beside the official score, placed with a deliberateness that was inconsistent with the random placement of a working musician's materials. He took out his handkerchief and used it to pick up the folded paper. He opened it. Inside was a single staff of music, 8 notes, written in the maestro's distinctive hand, the hand of a man who had written music for 50 years and whose notation was as individual as a signature. Poirot looked at the notes for a long time. Then he folded the paper carefully, wrapped it in his handkerchief, and placed it in his breast pocket beside the letter. "Inspector Pemberton," he said quietly, "I think we should wait for the post-mortem before reaching conclusions." Pemberton looked at him. He had known Poirot for 12 years and understood what this kind of quietness meant. "You think it wasn't natural?" Poirot looked at the stage, the fallen music stand, the orchestra still in their seats in the specific paralysis of people who do not know what to do. The 500 faces in the auditorium all turned toward them with the collective expression of people who came for beauty and have received instead something else entirely. "I think," said Poirot carefully, "that Maestro Voss left me a message, and that a man who leaves a message is a man who expected that a message might be necessary." He smoothed his moustaches. "Which means he expected what happened tonight." The house lights came fully up. The Regal concert hall, in all its honey and mahogany and amber electricity, contained a dead man and a great deal of unfinished music. Les petites cellules grises, Poirot reflected, had begun. The post-mortem results arrived at 9:30 the following morning, delivered to Inspector Pemberton at Scotland Yard by a police surgeon who had the manner of a man delivering news he found personally interesting rather than professionally troubling. Digitalis toxicity. Not the accumulation of a lifetime's cardiac medication, not the slow, ambiguous poisoning that doctors sometimes produced through miscalculation or inattention. This was a single, deliberate, or substantial additional dose, sufficient to produce cardiac arrest in a man already taking therapeutic amounts for a pre-existing condition, delivered at some point in the 2 hours before the performance, absorbed and acted upon with the reliable precision of a compound that had been understood by pharmacists since the 18th century. Poirot sat in Pemberton's office and listened to this recitation with the absorbed concentration of a man recognizing, one by one, the pieces of a picture he had already suspected the outlines of. "The water glass," said Poirot. "Analyzed this morning. The remaining water was clean," said Pemberton. "Whatever was used was either dissolved completely and consumed, or administered by another method." "The dressing room," said Poirot. Pemberton looked at him. "How did you—" Because the maestro arrived at the Regal at 5 o'clock for a 7:30 performance, he would have spent approximately 2.5 hours in his dressing room, eating, resting, preparing. His digitalis tablets were taken, according to Dr. Braun's prescription schedule, at 6 o'clock in the evening. Someone with access to the dressing room could have replaced 2 of the tablets with a stronger dose, or added additional tablets to the bottle, or dissolved additional digitalis in whatever the maestro consumed for his pre-performance meal. Poirot paused. Who had access to the dressing room? Pemberton consulted his notebook. The maestro's personal assistant, a man named Roland, who left at 6:30. His wife, Sophia Voss, who was with him until 7. His son, Julian Voss, who visited briefly at 6:45. Conrad Dean, the proprietor, who looked in at approximately 6:15. Dr. Braun, who attended the maestro at 6 and confirmed the digitalis dose at that time. And Elena Marchetti, the soprano, who according to Roland came to the dressing room uninvited at around 6:50 and spent approximately 10 minutes with the maestro. And the dressing room was unattended at any point, between 6:30 when Roland left and 7 when Sophia Voss says she departed for her own seat. So 30 minutes when access was possible without direct observation. He paused. Conrad Dean has a master key to all rooms on the building's backstage level. Julian Voss was seen going briefly toward the corridor near the dressing rooms at 6:50 by the stage manager. Elena Marchetti was in the corridor from 6:45 at the earliest. Poirot nodded. He took from his breast pocket the handkerchief containing the folded manuscript paper and laid it carefully on Pemberton's desk. "The message," he said. Pemberton looked at the 8 notes on the staff. He was not, he said immediately, a musician. He could read music approximately in the way that he could read French, enough to understand the general direction without being confident of the nuance. "The notes," said Poirot. "Spell a name." "Not directly." The maestro was too careful for anything so easily read. He encoded it in the note names themselves, as musicians can, because the notes of the Western scale carry letter designations, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. He used only the notes whose letter names form a word. He pointed to the staff. D, E, A. "Padan." "Dean?" said Pemberton. "Conrad Dean." "That was my first reading," said Poirot. "And it may be correct. But I spent last night with the score of the 3rd movement. Inspector, the maestro sent me the complete manuscript score 3 weeks ago, before the performance, with a note that I was to study the 3rd movement specifically." He removed a second piece of paper from his pocket, a page of the score covered in his own penciled annotations. In the 3rd movement, there is a passage for solo cello that uses an unusual notation. The maestro indicated specific rest values, places where the cello is silent, that are unnecessary from a musical perspective. They do not serve the rhythm or the phrase. They serve nothing except to be noticed by someone who was told to notice. Pemberton leaned forward. "In Morse code," said Poirot, "those rests, their lengths, their pattern, produce CONRAD. He set the paper down. "Conrad, first name only, which supports the note name reading. Conrad Dean." "He's telling us the killer is Conrad Dean," said Pemberton. "He's telling us that Conrad Dean is a danger," said Poirot carefully. "He's telling us to look at Conrad Dean. He's not necessarily telling us that Dean committed the murder because the maestro wrote this score 3 weeks ago, before the concert, before the moment of his death. He wrote it when he knew something, feared something, suspected something. What he feared has now occurred. But whether the man he named is the one who acted, that remains to be established." He picked up his hat. "I should very much like to speak to Julian Voss and to Elena Marchetti. And to Sophia Voss, if she is receiving visitors." "And Conrad Dean?" Poirot paused at the door. "Conrad Dean I shall see last, when I know everything else." He turned. A man who is named in a dead composer's final score as the object of suspicion, he will be defensive, careful, prepared. I should prefer to approach him when I no longer need anything from him except the truth. He went out into the grey London morning, where September had begun its annual programme of preparing the city for autumn, and walked toward Kensington with the measured pace of a man in whom a very precise and focused engine had been running since the previous evening and showed no signs of stopping. The maestro had written him a message in the only language he entirely trusted. Poirot intended to be worthy of it. Julian Voss occupied a flat in Bayswater, not a poor flat, but a modest one, which was a statement in itself given that he was the only son of Maestro Raphael Voss and might therefore have been expected to live more substantially. The modesty, Poirot suspected, was intentional, the apartment of a man who wished to be judged as a musician rather than as an inheritance. Julian was 34, with his father's height but not his father's stillness. He was a man in motion, pacing when he was not sitting, moving his hands when he was not pacing, with the physical restlessness of someone whose internal activity has always been slightly too large for whatever room they inhabit. He was a violinist of genuine gift, according to the musicological opinions Poirot had gathered the previous evening, but a violinist who had spent his career playing first desk in various orchestras rather than achieving the solo career that his talent, apparently, warranted. "He never pushed me forward," said Julian, not with bitterness, but with the flat accuracy of a man who has spent a long time examining a fact and has determined that it is what it is. There was always a reason, always a season when the timing wasn't right. He said I needed more experience. He said my technique needed development. He said the audiences weren't ready. He stopped. He had been saying these things for 15 years. My technique was developed. The audiences were ready. The real answer was that he preferred to be the only Voss that mattered. "And the will?" said Poirot. Julian's jaw tightened. "It was not," Poirot observed. A surprised tightening, not the tightening of a man hearing an unexpected question, but the tightening of a man hearing an expected question he had been preparing for. "You know about it," said Julian. "I know what it says. I should like to know what you feel about what it says." "It says the final symphony, which is worth a considerable sum in publication and recording rights, and considerably more in the long term, belongs to Elena Marchetti." He said the name with the controlled flatness of a man carefully removing all color from a word. "Not to his wife of 40 years, not to his son, to Elena Marchetti, who has known him for 8 years and who was his protégé." "When did you learn of the will's contents?" 6 weeks ago. Father told me himself. He said he wanted me to hear it from him and not from solicitors. He said he hoped I would understand." Julian laughed, a short, precise sound with no humor in it whatsoever. "I did not understand. You argued?" "We argued, yes. He was immovable. He said Elena understood his music in a way that justified the decision. He said the symphony was part of her as much as it was part of him." A pause. "He said things about Elena that a father does not normally say about his protégé." Poirot was very still. "What kind of things?" he said. Julian looked at him. The restlessness had stopped, a notable cessation, as though someone had turned off an engine. "He said she had his musical voice. He said when she sang he heard something familiar. Not in the technical sense, but in a deeper sense. He said he used the Italian word, sangue, blood." "He said she was his blood." Julian paused. "I thought it was the romantic language old men use about their protégés. I thought nothing of it. Now I am not sure." Poirot absorbed this. He looked around the flat, the violin case on the table, the stacked scores, the framed photograph on the mantelpiece of a much younger Julian on a stage, bow raised, with an expression of pure joy that the current Julian seemed to have mislaid somewhere in the subsequent 15 years. "The evening of the concert," said Poirot. "You visited your father's dressing room at 6:45.
For perhaps 5 minutes. We spoke not about the will, we had agreed to put that aside for the evening. He seemed well, nervous, which was unusual for him. He was not normally nervous before performances. He paused. He asked me something strange. He asked me whether I had told anyone about the letter I received. "Letter," said Poirot. Julian looked at him with a quality of reassessment. "You didn't know about the letter? Tell me about the letter." 3 days ago, I received a letter, unsigned, typewritten. It said, he paused, clearly recalling it precisely. It said, "The will is not what you think it is. The original has been replaced. Before you accept what you have been told, ask Elena Marchetti what she knows about your father's real intentions." He paused. I showed it to father. He became very agitated. He told me to ignore it. He said it was mischief. But his agitation was not the agitation of a man dismissing something trivial. Poirot rose slowly. "Do you still have the letter?" "Yes, I should like to see it."
"John and Julian," Poirot paused at the door with the specific quality of casualness he used when the question being asked was not casual. "Where were you between 6:30 and 7 on the evening of the concert?" The restlessness had not returned. Julian sat very still. "In the corridor outside the dressing rooms," he said, "for approximately 20 minutes. I was thinking about the will, about everything." He looked at Poirot steadily. "I did not go back into the dressing room. I did not tamper with anything. I sat in the corridor and thought, and then I went to my seat." Poirot looked at him for a long moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful, open quality of a man ensuring he has seen everything available to be seen. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. Elena Marchetti was staying at the Ritz, which Poirot noted without judgment. Artists of her standing were maintained in the appropriate style by their engagements, and Elena Marchetti's standing in the world of European opera was considerable. She had sung at La Scala, at the Vienna State Opera, at Covent Garden. She had a voice that the critics described, in various languages, with the same fundamental metaphor. It was like being told a truth you had not known you needed to hear. She received Poirot in her sitting room, a beautiful room that she had populated in a few days of residence with the kind of personal objects that made it hers. Scores open on the writing table, a small framed photograph, a vase of yellow roses that she had apparently acquired for herself rather than received. She was 32, dark-haired, with the open, composed face of someone who had spent her professional life communicating emotion at high volume and had consequently developed a very clear idea of the difference between expressed and actual feeling. She was genuinely grieving. Poirot saw this immediately and set it aside as a constant rather than a variable. "You knew him well," said Poirot. "Not a question." "For 8 years," she said. "He heard me sing at a concert in Florence in 1928. I was 24, and I had a great deal of voice and very little understanding of what to do with it. He came backstage and he said—" She paused, and something in her face softened into the particular expression of someone re-entering a memory. He said, "You sing as though you are trying to reach something. Let me show you how to reach it." He became your teacher, my mentor. She stopped. "He was the most important person in my professional life. In many ways, in my personal life as well. There are people who shape you, Monsieur Poirot. Not many. He was that person for me." "And the will?" She looked at him steadily. "He told me about it 2 years ago. He said he had decided that the final symphony should go to me because he believed I would know what to do with it, that I would understand it and serve it properly, and that in my voice he heard the music as it was intended." She paused. "I was humbled. I told him I thought Julian should inherit it. He said Julian was a fine musician, but not the right custodian for this particular work." "Julian received a letter," said Poirot, suggesting that the will had been altered, that the original said something different from what he had been told. Elena was very still for a moment. "I know about the letter," she said. "You know? The maestro told me about it.
He received a similar letter, and there was a third. Mrs. Voss also received one. She looked at Poirot with the directness of someone who has decided to extend full trust. Someone has been trying to create disorder around the will for the past 2 weeks, creating suspicion, setting the family against each other. She paused. The maestro believed he knew who was responsible. Conrad Dean! A silence that confirmed it without the word. Tell me about Dean, said Poirot. The maestro and Conrad Dean had an agreement, made 15 years ago when the maestro was still conducting regularly at the Regal.
Dean provided him with exclusive use of the hall for his major concerts, and the maestro, in return, allowed Dean to use his name and his reputation in the hall's marketing, its applications for grants, its positioning in the cultural establishment. She paused. What the maestro discovered 6 months ago was that Dean had been going considerably further. He had been submitting grant applications to the Arts Council, to private foundations, to several titled patrons, using the maestro's name as the artistic director of programs that the maestro had never agreed to, never seen, and in several cases never heard of. The funds from these grants were being redirected. Embezzlement, said Poirot, using the maestro's reputation as the instrument. The maestro was furious. He had been, in the most literal sense, used.
His name attached to fraud. She looked at her hands. He told me he intended to make a public statement after the concert, that the concert would be his farewell to the Regal, and that what followed would be a full accounting. Dean knew this? The maestro had told him directly, 1 week before the concert. He gave Dean 7 days to make voluntary restitution before he went to the press. She paused. Dean, by all accounts, did not respond well to this information. Poirot rose. He moved toward the photograph on the writing table, a photograph of Elena and the maestro, taken at what appeared to be a rehearsal, both looking at a score, both absorbed. There was in their proximity something that was not, Poirot thought, the proximity of teacher and student alone. It was the proximity of something older and more fundamental. Miss Marchetti, he said, I am going to ask you something, and I should like you to consider carefully before answering. Not because I doubt you, but because I believe the answer is important, and I want you to have a moment to determine whether you are ready to tell me. She looked at him. Did the maestro ever tell you, said Poirot, anything about your own history, about your parents, about the circumstances of your birth? The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Not empty, not evasive, but the silence of someone standing at the edge of a very large thing and deciding whether to step into it. He told me, she said at last very quietly, 8 months ago. He was ill that winter, a chest infection that frightened him with its severity, I think.
He called me to come to London, and when I arrived he told me. She stopped. He said he had known since my 3rd year of study with him. He had recognized. He said it was in the voice, and in certain things about the way I moved, and in a particular expression I made when I was concentrating. He recognized his own mother in me. And then he made inquiries, and he found the records, and he knew. He was your father, said Poirot. He was my father, said Elena Marchetti. She said it with the quality of someone who has been saying it privately, to herself, for 8 months, and is saying it out loud for the first time. My mother never told me. She died in 1930. He said she had written to him when she discovered she was pregnant, and that he was already married, Julian was already born, and he arranged for her to be supported. Financially, but he did not. He was not able to. She stopped. He said it was the great shame of his life, and that the will was, in part, an attempt to give me what he had not been able to give me when it would have mattered. Poirot said nothing for a moment. The yellow roses on the table were very bright in the September light from the window. Did Sophia Voss know? He said. Elena looked at him with eyes that held a great deal of complicated weather. I believe, she said, that she does now. Sophia Voss received Poirot at the house in Kensington that had been the maestro's London address for 30 years, a tall white stuccoed house of the kind that the Victorian era had produced in enormous quantities, and that London had since elevated into objects of considerable financial value. Inside,
it had the quality of a house that has been inhabited by a single strongly defined personality for a very long time, and that has consequently taken on something of that personality, ordered, musical, with a specific orientation toward beauty that was neither decorative nor acquisitive, but functional, as though the things in the rooms were there to be used and appreciated rather than possessed. Sophia Voss was 68, white-haired, with a face that had once been striking and was now something more interesting. The face of a woman who had spent decades being the wife of a very large personality and had, in the process, developed her own, quieter but no less substantial. She offered tea, which Poirot accepted, and she poured it herself. And she sat across from him with the composure of someone who has been preparing for a conversation and has decided to conduct it in full possession of herself. "You know what I want to ask," said Poirot. "You want to ask about Elena," she said, "about whether I knew, and about the letter." "Yes, I did not know," she said. "For 30 years I did not know. Raphael was faithful in the long term. Whatever occurred before our life together had settled. It had settled. He was a good husband, not an easy one. Genius is not easy to live with, and Raphael's genius was not the gentle kind, but a good one." She paused. "I received the letter on Monday, 3 days before the concert." "And the letter said?" "It said that Elena Marchetti was Raphael's natural daughter."
"It said he had known for several years and had concealed it from me. It said the will giving her the symphony was not merely a professional decision, but a personal one, an act of paternal recognition." She poured more tea into her already full cup, apparently without noticing. "It also said that I should ask Julian what he intended to do about the situation." Poirot was very still. "Why Julian specifically?" Sophia set down the teapot. She looked at her hands for a moment, the hands of a woman who had spent 68 years doing things with them and who was now holding them still with a deliberateness that spoke of effort. "Julian received money," she said, "from his father 2 years ago. A substantial sum, not from the estate, from his father's personal account. Raphael told me it was a loan. It to help Julian with some financial difficulties. Julian's career, as you may know, has not been—" She paused. "It has not been what his talent warranted. There were debts." She paused again. "I did not inquire too deeply. One does not, in a marriage, inquire too deeply into everything. There are rooms you agree not to enter." "But the letter made you reconsider the loan," said Poirot. "The letter suggested that the money was not a loan at all, that it was a settlement, a payment made in exchange for Julian's agreement not to contest the will once its contents were known." She looked at Poirot directly. "The letter suggested that Raphael had bought Julian's silence, and that Julian had taken the money, and then, when he understood fully what the will entailed, and had decided the price was not sufficient." Poirot sat very quietly with this for a moment. "Sophia," he said, "who do you believe wrote the letters? All 3 of them, to you, to Julian, to Elena?" She looked at him. Something moved across her composed face. Not emotion, but the assessment of a woman deciding how much of her own thinking she is willing to share with a stranger who is also, she has clearly decided, not entirely a stranger. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Victor Lansley wrote them." "The music critic," said Poirot. "Why Lansley?" "Because Victor Lansley has spent 12 years writing notices that were systematically hostile to Raphael's later work. Not because he disliked the music, he is too good a musician to have genuinely disliked it, but because Raphael refused, in 1924, to provide a testimonial for Lansley's application to the directorship of the Royal Academy of Music. The post went to someone else. Lansley blamed Raphael." She paused. "A man who nurses a grievance for 12 years is a man who notices everything. Lansley would have known about Elena, about Julian's financial situation, about the will, and his motive for writing the letters, to create chaos, to ensure that whatever Raphael's last evening was supposed to be, it became instead an evening of family crisis, of accusation, of disruption." She paused. He succeeded, in part. The family was in disarray before the concert even began. Julian was angry. I was not myself. She stopped. And Raphael knew it. He knew what was happening, and he was distressed. And distress is not what a 70-year-old man with a heart condition needs on the evening of his most important performance. Poirot rose. He moved to the window and looked out at the White House across the street at the September afternoon, at the ordinary life of a city that continued regardless. "One question," he said, without turning. "The night of the concert, between 7 and 7:30, after you left the dressing room and before the performance began, where were you?" "In my seat," said Sophia. "With the Lansleys, as it happens. Victor Lansley and his wife took the seats adjacent to mine. We spoke. He was entirely civil. He congratulated me on the occasion and expressed admiration for the maestro's achievement." She paused. "He smiled a great deal." Poirot turned. "That," he said, "is very interesting indeed." He went toward the door and then stopped and turned once more. "Sophia, the morning after the concert, when you were told that the post-mortem had found evidence of digitalis toxicity, what did you think?" She looked at him with those composed 68 years' worth of eyes. "I thought," she said, "of Conrad Dean, and I thought of Julian. And then I thought, because I am honest enough finally to be honest, I thought also of myself." She paused. "I had the motive and I had the access. I think you should know that I know that." "I do know it," said Poirot. "Thank you for saying so." He left her in the house of the man who had loved music more than almost anything else and had managed, nonetheless, to make several very human mistakes, as composers and geniuses and ordinary men all do, each in their own proportion. Victor Lansley was found dead in his room at the Cadogan Hotel on the morning of the third day after the concert. The hotel maid reported it at 7:45. By 8:15, Inspector Pemberton was in the room, and by 8:30, Poirot had received the telephone call and was in a taxicab moving through the September morning traffic with the contained urgency of a man for whom haste is a mental rather than physical condition. The room was on the third floor, south-facing, with a view of the gardens that Lansley had apparently not been in a position to appreciate for some hours. He was in his chair, not in bed, but in the armchair by the writing table, as though he had sat down during an evening of work and had not risen. He was 62, lean, with a critic's precise, evaluating face that had lost in death the evaluating quality and retained only the precision. He had not been arranged. He had simply, by all appearances, stopped. On the writing table before him was a score, a printed copy of the program booklet for the maestro's final symphony, which the Regal had produced for the audience. It was open to the third movement, and on the program, in handwriting that was not Lansley's, someone had written across the top of the page, "He knew too much about the third movement." Beside the program was a folded piece of paper, a document of several pages handwritten that Pemberton examined with the expression of a man who had been in police work for 20 years and was still capable of being surprised by the specific inventiveness of human wrongdoing. "It's a will," said Pemberton. "Or a copy of a will, Raphael Voss, handwritten, not the solicitor's version, a personal draft." He handed it to Poirot with his handkerchief. "Read the fourth clause." Poirot read. The fourth clause of the handwritten draft was different from the will that had been filed with the maestro's solicitors. In the solicitor's version, the final symphony was left to Elena Marchetti. In this handwritten draft, which bore the maestro's unmistakable signature and the date of 2 years previously, the final symphony was divided equally between Elena Marchetti and Julian Voss, with a note explaining the decision in terms that were both personal and explicit about the reasons. "Someone changed the will," said Pemberton, "between this draft and the filed version. The personal bequest to Elena was written into the filed version and Julian's share written out. Or," said Poirot carefully, setting down the document, "someone has produced this handwritten draft for the purpose of suggesting that the filed version was tampered with. The draft may be genuine, or the draft may be the fabrication." He looked at the handwriting. I will need a comparison with authenticated samples of the maestro's handwriting. Why would someone fabricate a draft? To give Julian Voss grounds to contest the will, to insert sufficient ambiguity into the estate that Elena Marchetti's inheritance could be challenged, delayed, possibly denied. Poirot looked at the message written on the program, and Victor Lansley had apparently found this document or been given it. He knew about it.
And someone did not want him to act on that knowledge. The cause of death, the surgeon confirmed by noon, was potassium chloride, a compound that, administered in the right concentration, produced cardiac arrest indistinguishable from the natural kind, and that was conveniently extremely difficult to identify without specific testing. It had been, the surgeon believed, administered in Lansley's evening drink, the glass of scotch that sat half-consumed on the table beside his chair. "Same general approach as the maestro," said Pemberton. "Cardiac arrest, a compound added to a drink, someone who understands pharmacology, or someone who has access to a doctor who does," said Poirot. He looked at the room, at the score, the draft will, the half-consumed drink,
and something else he had noticed upon entry and had been examining from different angles since. "Pemberton, the chair is positioned to face the window, but when Lansley was found, his body was facing the writing table. He turned. After he sat down, he turned toward the table. Someone came in," said Pemberton. "Someone came in, and Lansley turned to greet them, and in the process of their conversation, someone put something in his drink." Poirot paused. He knew his visitor. He admitted them willingly. He had no reason to be afraid. He looked at the half-consumed scotch. The person who came, they brought the draft will with them. They showed it to Lansley. Perhaps they asked him to authenticate it, given his knowledge of the maestro's work. Perhaps they simply told him what it was. And then they killed him before he could tell anyone else. "Before he could tell the wrong person," said Poirot. "Or the right person, depending on one's perspective." He picked up his hat. "I need to make 3 telephone calls, Pemberton, and then I need to speak to Dr. Braun." Dr. Heinrich Braun, the maestro's personal physician, had offices in Harley Street, as one would expect, Poirot reflected, of a physician to a man of the maestro's standing. He had treated the maestro for 11 years and had prescribed the digitalis for a cardiac arrhythmia diagnosed in 1930. He was a careful, methodical man of 63 who had clearly spent the past 3 days in a state of considerable professional distress, given that his patient had died of an overdose of a compound he himself had prescribed. "The tablets in the maestro's dressing room," said Poirot. "You saw them on the evening of the concert at 6 o'clock when you attended. Were they his regular prescription?" "I confirmed the dose at that time, yes. The bottle was correct. The standard prescription of 0.25 milligrams, 72 tablets remaining in a bottle of 100. He paused. "I did not count the tablets individually. I looked at the bottle. Could additional tablets have been placed in the bottle before your arrival?" A long pause. "If the bottles were visually similar, the same size, same color, then additional tablets could have been placed in the existing bottle. Or the bottle could have been replaced with one containing a higher concentration preparation, and I would not necessarily have noticed." He looked at Poirot steadily. "I've been asking myself that question for 72 hours. One more question. Potassium chloride, for the purposes of producing cardiac arrest. Who in your immediate professional or personal circle would know how to obtain it and administer it effectively?" Dr. Braun was quiet for a long moment. "Almost anyone with basic medical training," he said carefully. "It is not obscure knowledge." He paused. "But the administration, in a drink, at the right concentration to act within a specific time frame, that suggests someone who was not guessing, someone who had thought about it." Poirot nodded. He rose, buttoned his coat. Besant looked at the Harley Street consulting room, its diplomas, its measuring instruments, its quiet professional order. "Dr. Brown," he said, "did the maestro ever ask you, in a medical context, about the lethal dose thresholds for cardiac medications?" The doctor looked at him. "6 months ago," he said slowly.
He asked me, in passing, what someone would need to know in order to cause cardiac arrest in a person already on digitalis therapy, without it being immediately apparent. He paused. He said he was writing a piece of music, that the scenario was for a composition. I accepted the explanation. And what did you tell him? I told him that additional digitalis dissolved in liquid would be the most straightforward approach, and that the concentration needed would not be large. Thank you, said Poirot. He went out into Harley Street, where the September morning had clarified into a pale, cool afternoon, and he walked for 20 minutes without any particular destination, because what he was doing was not walking but thinking, and the thinking was now very nearly complete. Poirot arranged the gathering for the evening of the 5th day, back at the Regal Concert Hall, which had remained closed since the night of the concert, its management apparently uncertain whether to press forward with the scheduled season or to wait for the investigation to resolve itself. He arranged it with the specificity he brought to all final gatherings: the time chosen, the room chosen, the order of chairs chosen, the particular quality of the lighting chosen. These were not performances, they were functional decisions.
Because the environment in which the final account was given affected the nature of the account, and Poirot's experience of 40 years had taught him that people told the truth more completely in the right conditions than in wrong ones. The main hall, with its empty seats and its unlit stage, was the right conditions for this particular truth. The amber electric lamps along the gallery tier were left on. The stage itself was dark except for a single light above the conductor's podium, the podium on which the maestro's baton still rested, where it had been left on the night of his death by some instinct of the stage staff that to move it would be wrong. They came at 7 o'clock, Julian Voss, Elena Marchetti, Sophia Voss, Conrad Dean and Dr. Braun. They came because Inspector Pemberton had requested their presence with the official weight that made refusal inadvisable. They came and they arranged themselves in the first 3 rows of the stalls with the wariness of people who know they are in the same room with other people who have been doing the same things they have, lying, concealing, calculating, and occasionally telling the truth. Conrad Dean sat at the end of his row, with the particular quality of a man who has spent 5 days preparing multiple versions of events and is waiting to see which version the evening requires. He was compact, silver-haired, with a businessman's face that had been very carefully managed for most of its 50 years. Poirot stood before them in the aisle, not on the stage, because this was not a performance. 5 days ago, he said,
Maestro Raphael Voss died on this stage in the 3rd movement of his final symphony. He died of digitalis toxicity administered by someone who had access to his dressing room and who replaced his prescription tablets with a higher concentration preparation between 6 and 6:30 on the evening of the concert. He paused. He knew he was in danger. He had known for several weeks. He left a message in the score of the 3rd movement and on the conducting desk identifying the person he feared, and he left a second message in the letter he sent me 6 weeks ago, asking me to listen to the 3rd movement. He looked at Conrad Dean. The message named Conrad, said Poirot. Not as a certainty. The maestro was not certain. He feared, he suspected, but his fear and his suspicion were well-founded. Because Conrad Dean had both the motive and the means. He paused. The motive, the maestro intended to make public the evening of the concert that Dean had for 10 years been submitting fraudulent grant applications in the maestro's name, diverting the funds to his own use. The total sum diverted was, by the maestro's calculation, in excess of £14,000. The revelation would have ended Dean's career and very probably resulted in prosecution. Dean's face had not moved. He was very still. The means. Dean held a master key to all backstage areas of the Regal. He entered the maestro's dressing room between 6 and 6:30, while the room was briefly unattended, and replaced the digitalis tablets. He had asked Dr. Braun, 6 months previously, posing as a concerned associate of the maestro, what the dangers of digitalis overdose were in a man of the maestro's profile. Dr. Braun gave him the information that he needed. Poirot looked at Braun. "You did not know the purpose of the inquiry. That is not your fault." Dr. Braun said nothing. His expression was the expression of a man who has been carrying a very heavy thing for 5 days and has just been told he can put it down. "Victor Lansley," said Poirot, turning to Julian. "Victor Lansley did not write the letters designed to create disruption among the family. He received one of those letters himself, a letter that told him about the handwritten draft will and implied that the filed version had been altered. He was, as your mother suspected, gathering material, not for mischief, Tessa's, but for an article. He intended to write about the maestro's estate and the circumstances surrounding it. He had obtained, from a source he trusted, a copy of what he believed to be the maestro's original draft will, a document suggesting that Julian had been written out of a bequest he was meant to share. He looked at Julian. "You wrote that draft," said Poirot. "You forged it. You have your father's handwriting in your bones. You grew up with it, read it on scores and letters and notes your entire life. You produced a convincing imitation of a will that had never existed, and you arranged for Lansley to receive it because you knew his hostility to your father would make him credulous."
And then because a credulous critic with a platform could create precisely the kind of public doubt about the will that might allow you to contest it. Julian was very still. "And when Lansley told you he intended to show the document to the police for authentication," said Poirot, "you visited him at the Cadogan Hotel. You brought his evening drink from the decanter in his room, and you added to it the potassium chloride that you had obtained from a pharmacy supply contact through your medical school friend, a name that Inspector Pemberton now has." He paused. "You killed Victor Lansley, who was a nuisance and an enemy of your father, and a man whose death you calculated would not be deeply mourned. It was, in your assessment, a practical solution," Julian Voss said. Into the silence. "He was going to ruin everything." "He was going to ruin your fraud," said Poirot. "That is not the same thing." The hall was very quiet. The stage light fell on the empty podium, on the baton resting where it had been left. Poirot looked at Elena and at Sophia and at the women they were, the daughter who had not known her father and the wife who had not known his secrets, both of them in the same room with the same loss, wearing it differently. "Conrad Dean killed the maestro," said Poirot. "Julian Voss killed Victor Lansley. Inspector Pemberton will attend to both." He stepped back. Pemberton, who had been standing at the rear of the hall throughout, moved forward with his constables. And the regal concert hall, in its amber evening light, held one moment of the particular silence, not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of conclusion, before the business of justice began its necessary, imperfect, entirely irreplaceable work. The autumn came to London with its usual combination of apology and insistence, the weather turning cold before anyone was quite ready, the trees in Hyde Park going from green to gold to brown with a speed that seemed each year faster than the year before. By the first week of October, the Regal Concert Hall had reopened and the season had resumed, and the name of Raphael Voss appeared on the autumn programme in a tribute concert scheduled for the 23rd. The legal matters proceeded with the slowness that legal matters required. Conrad Dean was charged with murder and fraud. His initial defense of complete denial lasted approximately as long as it took Pemberton's team to establish the pharmacy trail for the higher concentration digitalis tablets and to find in the Regal's financial records 11 years' worth of impeccably disguised theft conducted with the sort of ingenuity that is, Poirot reflected, almost more depressing than straightforward dishonesty, because it implied that Dean had genuinely talented capabilities which had been entirely committed to wrong purposes. Julian Voss' position was more complicated, legally and otherwise. The forgery was clear. The murder of Victor Lansley, a man who had, it had to be acknowledged, spent 12 years trying to damage the reputation of Julian's father, and who had, in his last days, been attempting to use a forged document to generate damaging publicity, was an act that the law was required to regard as murder, and that human beings, being human beings, found themselves unable to regard with any simplicity. He was charged. He would be tried.
Poirot left the nuances of prosecution to those whose job it was. The handwritten draft will was, as Poirot had suspected, a forgery, confirmed by 3 independent graphological experts who determined that while the handwriting was an exceptional imitation of the maestro's, certain consistent micro-variations in the letter formations suggested a person who had learned the maestro's hand through long familiarity rather than being the originator of it. Julian Voss had spent 34 years watching his father write. He had been, in a different sense than was meant, an exceptionally attentive student. The filed will stood. Elena Marchetti was the legal heir to the final symphony. Poirot visited Sophia Voss once, in the second week of October, in the Kensington house. She was, he found, managing with the composed competence of a woman for whom grief was not new, and for whom the particular variety of grief produced by discovering that the person you mourned had been keeping secrets was a thing she had, in the weeks since the concert, found a way to accommodate. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what Raphael intended, about why he told Elena and not me." "What have you concluded?" said Poirot. "That he was a coward," she said, without heat, with the flat accuracy of someone who has examined a fact from every angle and arrived at the same conclusion each time. He was the bravest musician of his generation and a very considerable coward as a man. He told Elena because telling her was an act of recognition. It gave him something. Telling me would have been an act of reckoning. He preferred to leave it to the will. She paused. It was not admirable, but it was human. And I have had 40 years to learn that he was both of those things simultaneously. Poirot nodded. "Elena," he said, "will you?" "I've invited her for tea," said Sophia. "Next Thursday. We have things to say to each other. I don't know what they will be, but they need to be said." She paused. "She has his voice. I heard it properly for the first time at the concert, before everything happened. She has his voice. And I should have known it years ago." He left her sitting in the afternoon light in the house that had held 40 years of one man's music and was learning now to hold something different. He saw Elena once more before she returned to Rome for the autumn season. She came to his flat unannounced, which he had found was the habit of people in whom something important had recently clarified. They came to the person who had been present at the clarification because they needed somehow to acknowledge it. She sat across from him and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want to perform the symphony, as it was intended. Complete the third movement." "Can you do that?" said Poirot. "Complete it?" "The maestro left sketches," she said. 40 pages of sketch development. He knew what the movement was intended to become. He had mapped it entirely. He simply had not written the final form. A skilled arranger working with the sketches and with the recordings from the concert. She paused. "And I knew his musical voice. I know what it was intended to say." She looked at Poirot with the direct, open gaze of someone who has recently received a very large inheritance and is still determining what to do with it. "He left it to me because he believed I could complete it." "Yes," said Poirot. "I think that is exactly why." The premiere of the completed final symphony was given on the 23rd of October at the Regal Concert Hall in the tribute concert, conducted by a young German conductor of great precision and clear feeling. Elena Marchetti sang the vocal passages that the maestro had incorporated into the second movement, passages that, in the light of what was now known about their relationship, had a quality that several of the critics who wrote about the evening attempted to describe and none quite managed. Poirot attended alone. He sat in the third row of the stalls, in the seat that had been reserved for him by a letter dated 6 weeks before the original concert, and he listened. The first movement, the second, and then the third, beginning with the passage for strings alone, the simple theme of extraordinary simplicity. The theme that had been playing when the maestro fell. The theme that was completed now by the hands and mind of the woman who had inherited it. Poirot was not, in the ordinary sense of the word, a man who wept at concerts. He was a man of precise emotions, carefully categorized. But there was, At the moment when the third movement arrived at its conclusion, the full orchestra, Elena's voice, the harmony resolving into something that felt less like an ending than a placing into rest, something in his eyes that a casual observer might have misidentified as the effect of the hall's warm lighting. Afterward, he walked home through the October evening, through streets that smelled of fallen leaves and coal smoke and the specific London combination of antiquity and practicality, and he thought about what the maestro had said on the stage in his last moments. Listen to the third movement, you'll understand. He had understood. He had understood the message in the notes, and the message in the rests, and the message in the letter 6 weeks earlier. He had understood also the larger thing, the thing the maestro had known about his own death and had committed to music because music was the only language capacious enough to hold everything he needed to say. The baton was in a glass case in the Regal's entrance hall by the decision of the new management. A small card beneath it read, Raphael Voss, 1866 to 1936. The case had been placed there not as a memorial but as a fact. The simple fact of a thing that had been real and had mattered. Poirot walked past it each time he visited the Regal. He always paused. He never said anything, because some acknowledgements are better conducted in silence. Les petites cellules grises rested, for now.